1996, yet another year from the mid-90s that saw groundbreaking albums released month after month. I will walk you through some of my favorites that defined 96 for me on this episode of Talking About Records. My name is G.I. Sanders from NTX Vinyl, a small chain of independent record shops in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. If you're not local but you are in the U.S., you can shop online at ntxvinyl.com and would love it if you'd subscribe to our channel here on YouTube and follow us across social media. At NTX Vinyl is the handle on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Let's talk about 1996. I was a senior in high school. So as you can imagine, a lot of these albums had a huge impact, not only on my life then, but have continued to resonate with me over the years. And in 96, when I was a senior, I'd been going to shows, concerts, and at clubs for a couple years at that point. And thinking back, it felt like I was an experienced connoisseur of music, but little did I know I'd be sitting here, 25, 30 years later, still talking about some of the albums. So a lot of the albums that came out in 96 were, second, third, fourth releases from a lot of the bands that started in the early 90s. And this is a year when alternative was still completely at the top of the charts in regards to sales, in regards to exposure, and kind of in the mainstream, if you will. It's an exciting year to look at because it kind of feels like a turning point in a lot of ways for a number of these bands. So I'm going to walk you through 15 of my favorite albums from that year that I own in my collection. Let's get to it. First on the list, we're going to start on March 26, 1996, and talk about the third album from Stone Temple Pilots. This is Tiny Music, Songs from the Vatican Gift Shop. This is an interesting one, honestly. Stone Temple Pilots came out of the gate strong with Core. In my opinion, got even better with Purple. And then they introduced Tiny Music, which was really, really different. You went from, a very heavy, grunge, straightforward rock sound on Core, and they started to experiment a little bit as you got into Purple with songs like Big Empty, songs with like Interstate Love Song. And then you get into Tiny Music. This one took a completely different turn. I need to get it open to actually look at some of the track lists because it's been a while. Big Bang Baby, I believe, was the lead-off single, which, thinking back, seeing that on MTV, that's really what stands out the most for me because the band, in a lot of ways, completely changed their image and took on a much more pop sensibility, I think, with this album. Pop's Love Suicide, Tumble in the Rough, Lady Picture Show was a big single. Tripping on a Hole in a Paper Heart, Art School Girl, Adhesive is a really great song. So is Seven Caged Tigers. So it's just one of those albums for me that kind of stands alone in their discography. It's really unique. And I like that about it. I really do. The artwork is very abstract, which, the band was kind of into at that time. If you look back at the artwork for Purple and certainly this song and then Shangri-La, which came a little later. But a fantastic record. It showed how diverse they were, which I think I really liked because, again, at that point you had, and we'll go through some of these, you had so many rock bands killing it at that time. Some of the most popular artists in the world were alternative rock bands. And for Stone Temple Pilots to take a chance like this and just really evolve their sound, I really appreciated it, and I think it really does stand the test of time. Great album to this day. Definitely check out Tiny Music if you're not familiar. Next on the list, a huge sophomore album by none other than Rage Against the Machine. Evil Empire released April 16th, 1996. I could talk about this album for the whole episode here, but I just, man, as far as sophomore records are concerned, the thing about a follow-up, how do you follow up a debut like Rage Against the Machine's self-titled record? I mean, it was so groundbreaking, so huge, so in your face. For me being a kid in high school, you want to talk about opening your eyes and your ears to true art. Like, that's what Rage meant to me. When this album drops, obviously a completely different visual. It was very, very almost abrasive when I remember seeing this cover. Like, what is this cartoonish thing after Rage? The first record was just so in your face. But then you had songs like Bulls on Parade. I remember hearing that as the first single on the radio before the album came out, and just being completely overwhelmed and excited because it was just as good as the first record. And that's what the fear is, when a band comes out with a huge debut like Rage did, there's this little thing in the back of your head like, oh man, how are they going to top that? How are they going to do anything even remotely as good? How are they going to evolve? Well, they certainly did here. Tom Morello's songwriting and riffs and creativity on the guitar, I think, fuel this record even more so than on the first one. A lot of really unique sounds. People of the Sun kicks it off, which is a huge track. Vietnam, Revolver, Snake Charmer, Tire Me, Down Rodeo was a big single as well. Roll Right, I think, is really underrated on this album. Just a huge record. Saw the band on this tour in Fort Worth in '96, and probably one of my favorite memories from this tour was the fact that we had, me and a bunch of friends, we had general admission, no seats on the floor, kind of a small arena. And we walked into the back of the floor, coming down out of the concourse as Rage started. I just remember we're halfway down the ramp, the lights go out, and People of the Sun starts. So we're literally kind of running or walking really fast down the concourse, back of the floor, right as it erupts. And we're, a basketball court away from the stage, but within no less than 30 seconds, I was up against the rail because the entire crowd started jumping and moving and moshing. And so you just kind of ebbed and flowed with it. And so within seconds, I went from barely being on the floor to right up against the rail, front row for those first couple songs. It was just an incredible experience. The energy that Rage brings live is unparalleled. And I think this is a pretty underrated record. You hear a lot about the first record. They had a short-lived career as far as studio albums were concerned, but most of the time you hear about that first record, which, believe me, I love as well. But Evil Empire, if you had to ask me what my favorite Rage record is, this is it. This is it right here, coming from 1996. Absolutely love this record. Check it out if you're not familiar. Next on the list, released May 21st, 1996. A totally different vibe from the Wallflowers. This is Bringing Down the Horse. I will admit, I did not get into this album until many, many years later. I knew the singles, of course. It was a big, big record on radio with One Headlight, 6th Avenue Heartache, were huge singles. And I knew Bob Dylan, of course. But I was a teenager, so I didn't know Bob Dylan the way I know him now. And then I knew this was Bob Dylan's son, and so there was a little bit of a connection there. But again, there wasn't that much nostalgia for me. It didn't mean that much. And I was into way heavier stuff, honestly, at that time, like Rage and Tool and things like that. But a couple years later, I did get into this record and have loved it ever since. It's a great, great debut. And I think, on this list of heavy hitters, which we're going to go through, that came out in '96, it just shows you how good this record is, that it could stand out on radio and really break through. It obviously didn't hurt that it was Bob Dylan's son fronting the band. But that aside, I think the songwriting really does stand up, and through, really great record. I don't know if I'd say this is kind of Americana leaning. I think it's got a little bit of that pop rock Americana. Just a great album, great songwriting, no frills from Jacob Dylan and company. Bringing Down the Horse. Released that same day, May 21st, 1996. This one I vividly remember because it was highly anticipated, and this is Down on the Upside by Soundgarden. A pretty tough album, honestly, for a couple of reasons. Not because it's not great musically, but this came out at a time when, the band was kind of on a decline. Again, not musically, not creatively, but as far as their relationships with each other. I did have the opportunity to see the band on this tour, on this album cycle when they were playing Lollapalooza. Metallica was headlining, but there was also bands like Screaming Trees, I believe Rancid, the Melvins. Pretty good lineup. Soundgarden, it was tough. Like, you could just tell they weren't happy, and that's frustrating. But again, looking back on the arc of their career, this had to be their last album of that era before they reunited. Um, and it really does, I think, hold up well as kind of maybe their most raucous record. Like, you've got some punk rock stuff on here, like No Attention. Um, You've got really cool songs, unique songs like Overfloater and Boot Camp. But then you had the huge singles, Blow Up the Outside World, Burden in My Hand, Rhinosaur's a great track, Pretty Noose, Dusty's a great song, Ty Cobb. I'm naming the whole track list, but you get the idea. Again, a hard time for a band like Soundgarden. They'd been at it for 10 years already. And then they exploded with Bad Motorfinger and Super Unknown, and got, skyrocketed into being one of the most known and popular bands at that time. And so it's just a tough record in 96 when they're kind of imploding personally and are getting towards the end of their time as a band. For this one to come out, it's an expansive record. It's pretty diverse, and like I mentioned, it's got some of the most aggressive Soundgarden stuff as far as like up tempo stuff. But then it was all over MTV2 with the big singles. So they certainly could have stayed the course, but looking back, it kind of felt like the end of an era in a lot of ways for this band. And thank God they did reunite years later, because they did continue to, do a bunch of great tours and put out great music. But down the upside, kind of feels like a bookend in a lot of ways for me for the greatness of Soundgarden. I love this record, and I do think it's really underappreciated in a lot of ways, and that's just because it gets overshadowed by, like I said, Bad Motorfinger and Super Unknown that came before it. But if you're not familiar with Down the Upside, definitely check it out. Fantastic record from Soundgarden, and it was highly anticipated at the time, and still a great spin to this day. Next on the list, released May 28th, just a week later in 1996, is another sophomore album from Porno for Pyros. Obviously, the Perry Farrell fronted band that came after Jane's Addiction. The band is most well known for the first record with the big song Pets. But I would take this album all day long. I absolutely love this record. Songs like Tahitian Moon, Kimberly Austin, the title track, Dogs Rule the Night, 100 Ways. Just a beautiful, beautiful album. Really eclectic. A lot of different instrumentation. And it just showed to me how creative Perry Farrell could be. A fantastic recording in general. It's hard to, I wish they would have stayed together. I think there was so much more that Perry could have done with the band, honestly. And for me, it's a completely different style than what he was doing with Jane's Addiction, which was a lot more straightforward, a lot more rock-oriented, versus Porno for Pyros just brought in all kinds of different influences, which I really appreciated. This album did not get the attention and the love that I think it deserved. And to this day, I think it's still pretty underrated. But it is a great, very eclectic alternative record. And I think for me, it was a no-brainer to highlight this one, of one of those that really made an impact from 1996. Moving along to June 18th of 1996. This was a big one. I was a huge fan of Beck when this album came out. I knew, obviously, like everybody did, Beck from the breakthrough song, essentially Loser, on Mellow Gold, which wasn't his first record, but it was a breakthrough record. And then comes Odelay, and it's hard to think back, because now Beck as such a completely diverse and interesting artist, because he has so many different styles. But when Odelay hits, coming out of Mellow Gold, and if you go back even a little bit further to One Foot in the Grave and Stereopathic Soul Manure, when it was really folksy and indie, he breaks through with Mellow Gold. And then you get to Odelay, which is really shiny and really produced. And the songs are unstoppable. I mean, you've got songs like Devil's Haircut, obviously Where It's At, The New Pollution. And then you've got some of the album tracks on this, like Sissy Neck and Ready Made and High Five, Novocaine, Jackass, just absolute alternative classics in my opinion. Such a fun album, such a, again, just unique. That's the only word I can think of that best describes Beck, because from album to album, he changed so much. This was, I think, his... I guess it's his pinnacle album. I don't know. It's hard for me because I think back to, Sea Change is such a great record. So is, Midnight Vultures. There's a lot of great records in the Beck catalog. But I think if I had to point to one that really defined his career and kind of made him the artist that he is today, I think Odelay is that album. And it was huge. It was all over radio and MTV like a lot of these other albums I'm talking about. So definitely one that, even though Loser was his breakthrough, I think Odelay is the album that put Beck on the map. Released a week later on June 25th, 1996, you have Dust from the Screaming Trees, a fantastic record. Like I mentioned, saw the band touring with Soundgarden on Lollapalooza in this year. Was my only opportunity to see the band, which I regret. I wish I would have seen them a lot more often. I loved this record. It was a great follow-up after Uncle Anesthesia and after Sweet Oblivion, which was kind of their breakthrough, I think, from a mainstream perspective. Again, they had a very similar path, just like Soundgarden, where they started out and had several records before they were really discovered, and until alternative became more mainstream. But this album, with All I Know, Dying Days, Make My Mind, Sworn and Broken, man, just so good. Produced by George Draculius and mixed by Andy Wallace. Absolutely love Mark Lanegan. I love his voice. I think it's just so unique. He's kind of, to me, like the Jim Morrison of the 90s era because of how unique that sound was. And just such an underrated band and an underrated album during this time. It wasn't one where it got near the exposure of a lot of these other albums and artists, and it's just a shame looking back on it, because Screaming Trees is an absolutely phenomenal band. Dust is a great record, and in a lot of ways, kind of their last record, which was a shame. Similar story to Soundgarden, where they had just kind of gotten to the end of it after about 10 years of doing it, and so it's interesting to look at the parallels between this one and Down on the Upside. Another album that I love, and definitely one that I think is underrated on the list. A month later, on July 23rd, 1996, you get a debut album, which came out of nowhere. This is Tidal, from the greatness of Fiona Apple. Just a beautiful record. I mean, the artwork and the approach and the way that she came out of the gate. The videos on MTV were just so seductive. And, Sleep to Dream, Shadow Boxer, Criminal, those were big songs. But it's top to bottom on this. Sullen Girl, Never Is a Promise, The Child Is Gone. Just beautiful songwriting and great instrumentation. And it really stood out. Like, for me, I remember when this album came out, again, mainly seeing it on MTV as the first impression. It was just so unique during that time. I was listening to so much music with loud guitars, with aggression, certainly male fronted, and then you have Tidal, and it just takes you by storm. It's a completely different vibe, and man, does it sound great on vinyl. If you can find one of these Vinyl Me Please pressings of Tidal, which is the only versions that there are, never came out on vinyl originally, which is unfortunate, but a beautiful record. I still listen to it frequently to this day, and I think it does stand out, not only in 96, but I would say amongst the 90s, one of the more unique albums to really break through, especially for a debut album. So fantastic. Check out Tidal if you're not familiar. Released a week later on July 30th, 1996. We have what many consider to be the last from the original lineup of Alice in Chains, and that is their MTV Unplugged performance. It was recorded in April in 96 and then finally released later that year in July, like I mentioned. It's a hard one to talk about, honestly. MTV Unplugged and what that series meant to the mid 90s can't be really prefaced enough. I mean, from Nirvana to Pearl Jam to Eric Clapton to just so many artists, mainstream and new, to be able to strip out all of the noise and all the distraction and go unplugged was a beautiful thing. I think as much as any band, Alice in Chains benefited from it because they had acoustic-based songs already. They had Jar of Flies, they had Sap, they had stuff that fit right into this format. So when you bring out songs like Nutshell and Brother and Down in a Hole and No Excuses, Rooster, Frogs, one of my favorite Alice in Chains song off of the self-titled record, Got Me Wrong, Over Now, and then you got a new track, Killer Is Me. It was the swan song. It wasn't Lane's last show with the band, but it sure kind of felt like it in hindsight. They did go on to do a little bit of touring for the self-titled record, but it was very minimal. This was kind of the last time people saw Lane in the public in a really good light. It was an incredible performance, and I'm glad they did it. I'm glad they pulled it together, and they certainly pulled it off. Just a beautiful set. It's if you can pick it up on vinyl, please do. It sounds fantastic. It's unfortunately out of print when I'm filming this, but hopefully it will be back. I would think they're gonna do an anniversary treatment or a reissue of this one at some point. They've got to, because it is a very important album in the band's career, and I think obviously regarded as one of the more successful MTV Unplugged recordings, Alice in Chains. Next up, August 27th, 1996. This is an album I've talked about a lot. This is No Code by Pearl Jam. It is my favorite Pearl Jam album. I could, like I said earlier about, I think, Evil Empire, I could definitely talk a whole episode just about this. This is the album when most of the general public decided Pearl Jam was done, right? Maybe a little bit on Vitology, but definitely when you got to No Code, definitely when they came out of the gate with the first single, which is Who You Are. It's like they did everything they could. This is a Coke bottle clear version, which I really, really love. They did everything they could to distance themselves from, not necessarily from their audience, but from the mainstream. And I think it saved the band. I don't think Pearl Jam's here to this day if A, Jack Irons doesn't join the band, and if B, they don't do this record. Because when you listen to songs like In My Tree and songs like Present Tense, songs like Sometimes, Off He Goes, I mean, they were literally just like throwing the rule book out and doing whatever they wanted. And there was a little bit of that on Vitology. You could tell as Eddie took over a lot of the kind of songwriting responsibilities and leading into this one, but it was the drummer change. It really was. I've been in rooms with different drummers, and I can tell you that it changes everything. The dynamic shifts completely. So when you're a band like Pearl Jam and you've played hundreds of shows and you're one of the biggest bands in the world, and then you change the heartbeat, you change the drums, like it just makes you rethink everything, and that's what they did right here. I love the Polaroids. I love how this folds out. I love how it came with the inserted Polaroids, in addition to the artwork on the cover and the back. And it's just one of those albums that I think means so much to me because, again, it was that breaking point where most people are like, yeah, I'm done with that era of music. And for me, it was like, okay, great. That's my band. I'll take them now. And I just ran with it. And I'm still with them to this day. But yeah, most people you talk to and you say, what's your favorite Pearl Jam album? It's going to be 10 or versus maybe Vitology, maybe Yield, which comes a little bit later, after this one. But again, it's a turning point for a band. This is a turning point for me in regards to Pearl Jam's career arc, and holds a really special place. Love No Code, love it through and through. Love the diversity, love the songwriting, and I love what Jack Irons brought to the table. Moving ahead to September 17th of '96, let's talk about the sophomore album from the greatness of Cake. This is Fashion Nugget. I did not know their first record at all, so when this came out, it was completely new to me. Songs like The Distance and Race Car Ya-Ya's, obviously the I Will Survive cover was huge. She'll Coming Back to Me, Italian Leather Sofa, Sad Songs and Waltzes. Perhaps just such a great, very, I mean, you talk about unique. This kind of like, I think if I look down this list, is probably in the same vein of Title by Fiona Apple in regards to how different it was at the time. You know, again, most of what was dominating the charts, especially from a rock alternative standpoint, was heavy stuff. And then you've got a band like Cake, which I think kind of fits in also with Beck and Odelay, where it was very pop driven, very hooky, definitely kind of shiny in the production style. And it fit really well, and it broke through, and it was a huge record for the band, and I think it's still heralded as their best record. At least it is in my opinion. I don't know their whole catalog really well. I just really love this record and love how unique it is, especially for coming out in 1996. If I had to think of one word to describe this record, the word would be fun. That's just what Cake is, and that's just what Fashion Nugget represents. Also, September 17th, 1996, an album by a band called Tool comes out. Technically their sophomore album. They did have an EP, Opiate, that came out before. They broke through with Undertow. Huge album for them with songs like Sober and Prison Sex. And then comes Inema. And this is similar, very similar when I think back to Rage Against the Machine, because Undertow, even though I knew Opiate, but Undertow being the band's debut full length, was massive. I was a huge fan, and it was a groundbreaking album in so many ways. I'd never heard anything like it. And so, again, just trying to imagine what they're going to come up with, how they're going to top an album like Undertow. And then the first single drops, which was Stinkfist. And you want to talk about an eye-opener. Like, you never heard anything like it. Like, it's this weird, progressive, alternative metal thing. Like, it's a genre of its own, at least it was to me at my time. And you've got songs like Eulogy and Third Eye and the title track and 46 and 2. Still to this day, I think heralded as Tool's best, depending on what style of Tool you like, because there's a lot of them. But I do miss the Tool of the Inema days. I miss being able to go to a show and Maynard being at the front of the stage with the lights on him, screaming his head off. He may have had high heels and a bra on, or maybe in clown makeup or something. It was just completely abstract. The joke was on us in a lot of ways. I think back then, Maynard and company knew something we didn't, I think. And this was an album where this was kind of the last of that era. I look at Opiate, Undertow, and Inema as a very succinct period during their career, because once you get past Inema and you get into later albums, Lateralis, 10,000 Days, like, the level of musicianship and intricacy that they brought to the songwriting really progressed. And there's a little bit of that here on Inema, but this is way more straightforward than everything that came after it, And so, again, it's two totally different bands in a lot of ways. I was lucky enough to see the band multiple times on the Inema tour. I saw them at least 3 shows in smaller theaters, or kind of smaller venues, 2,000-3,000 seaters. And then saw him on Lollapalooza for this tour, which was incredible, because also on that bill was Snoop Dogg, which was really cool. But yeah, just a breakthrough. Even though Undertow was truly their breakthrough, this put them on the map to where you knew they were not going anywhere if they chose to stick around, which thankfully they have. But just a fabulous record. One of the best sounding records too. This is an original pressing I was lucky enough to get a few years ago from a buddy, and And it's just fantastic. Absolutely love it. Hopefully one day, they will reissue this on vinyl and everyone can own an official copy. I don't know if that day will ever come. I don't know why it hasn't come, other than legal issues, which is what the rumors are in regards to maybe the artwork or the music in general. But just a great record, and I don't think there was a bigger one in '96, at least not for me. Moving along 1 week to September 24th, another sophomore album, Pinkerton by Weezer. This was an interesting one. The Blue album was huge. Came out in '94, was a massive success for the band with huge singles all over, rock, pop, alternative radio, and MTV. And then Pinkerton drops, and it's completely different. It's not near as candy coated. It's not near as accessible in a lot of ways. But it is an album that has aged very well. And I don't know if I'd put it up there with the Blue album because I really love that record, but Get You, Tired of Sex, Across the Sea, El Scorcho, Falling for You. It's a great album. As the story goes, this is, I think, a breakup album. Rivers Cuomo going through a relationship, and this is kind of a relationship breakup, and this is what came out of it. And you can kind of tell it does not have that gloss that the Blue album had, but it does have some really great songs. For me, the best period of Weezer is, kind of Blue album, Pinkerton, getting into the Green album a little bit. And they've done a ton since then. And I haven't followed the band super closely since those early days for whatever reason. But I do absolutely love the early records, including Pinkerton. I didn't appreciate this one near as much at the time. And I think a lot of that is just because look at this list. Like in '96, there are so many great albums coming out that it's hard to gravitate towards every single one of them. And a lot of it was dictated by MTV and by radio. Again, you were at the, or at least I was at the mercy of those, as far as what I was getting exposed to for the most part as a teenager. And this one, didn't have near as big as singles and did not have near the marketing and publicity push that the Blue album had, just because it was not as accessible. But again, looking back now in hindsight, definitely a great album and a little underrated in their catalog, in my opinion. October 15th, 1996, another sophomore record. This has a lot of parallels, at least for me personally, mainly because the band's debut, August and Everything After, was huge, and I absolutely loved it. It was one that grabbed me right away. I don't even mind Mr. Jones. I'm not going to lie to you. I think it's a great track. And it was huge. That album came out, put the band on the map. It was very different for them. And then Recovering the Satellites comes out as their sophomore release. It did have really big singles on it because you got A Long December, which was on this, which was the biggest single by far. Catapult's a great song. Daylight Fading, Goodnight Elizabeth. Absolutely beautiful record. Now as I'm looking at the track list, I remember how good it is. And it's a great sophomore record. It's actually a little more in your face than the first record, other than maybe A Long December. Besides that, there's a much more aggression on this album than there is on the first record. And I think a lot of that probably comes with the band, performing live. They were touring like crazy in those days. And I think with that comes some energy into the studio. So this is one that has definitely aged really well, I think. And again, kind of like Pinkerton, where when you're coming off such a huge debut breakthrough album, it's really hard to follow that up. Think about Evil Empire, think about Pinkerton. Odelay wasn't Beck's second album by any means, but it was his second big mainstream album. So there's a lot of, same with Fashion Nugget, same with, Recovering the Satellites. It's one of those where you just always hear about the first record because it was so huge, and then it's got to be really hard to follow that up. Like that's why the sophomore slump is a thing, because bands go through it when you've got your whole life in some cases, or at least many years to write that first record. And then you turn around and you've maybe got a year, if you're lucky, to write the second one. So I love it when bands get to work and put out a sophomore record that is just as good as their debut, and Recovering the Satellites, in my opinion, is one of those. Last, but certainly not least, on albums from '96, from my collection, October 29th, an album that I had no idea came out in 1996 at that time. This is Being There by Wilco, an absolutely fantastic record by Jeff Tweedy and company. Songs like Misunderstood and Out of Sight, Out of Mind, Red Eyed and Blue, I Got You, Hotel Arizona, Sunken Treasure. Oh, it's a beautiful track. Kingpin, staples to this day in regards to the live set. I didn't know Wilco in 1996, totally off my radar. It took me probably till around 2000. You had to get into like Yankee Foxtrot to when I started to hear about them and then started to actually listen to them a little bit. But going back, which I've done a ton, because Wilco is one of my absolute favorite bands now, but being there definitely stands out as a pinnacle album in their career. Coming out of Uncle Tupelo and transitioning from a very Americana alternative country based band into kind of more of an alternative experimental sound. This is, you can start to hear them turn the corner on this, and of course they certainly turned it when you got into Yankee Foxtrot and Summer Teeth in that era. But this is kind of that in between album, I think, to where it's got the best of both worlds, where it's got that early kind of more Americana vibe, and then it's got a little bit of where they're going in the future. Looking back on it, it's a beautiful album, and one that I wish I would have known in 96. I wish on October 29th of 96 I would have bought this album, because then I would have been much further ahead of the game, and I had several more years to enjoy Wilco. But I've caught up, believe me, I've definitely caught up, and I love going back to the early stuff. I love being there. I think it's one of the highlights of their discography. So there you go. There's 15 albums from my collection that define the year for me. Yes, I know I'm missing a ton. This was 1996. Great albums were coming out every week. So let me know what I missed. There are a number that I wanted to include that I just don't have on vinyl, so I couldn't pull them out. And there's others that were huge hits, which just, again, just passed me by, and they didn't stick with me as much just because there was so much great music coming out at the time. It's fascinating to look back, especially in chronological order, and see when these albums came out throughout the year. For me, as a kid in high school, this was the soundtrack to my senior year, all these albums. And I can't tell you how grateful I am for that, to have been 16, 17, 18 years old when these types of albums were coming out. It absolutely set the stage, and I would not be here talking to you today if they had not been released. My name is G.I. Sanders. This has been Talking About Records. We'll see you again next time.